The yacht was called the Mary E, and it cost more than most families in Newport Beach would earn in 10 lifetimes. 47 feet of hand-finished teak and Burmese hardwood, brass fittings machined to order, velvet upholstery shipped from France, a floating room where California's wealthy could disappear from shore, from scrutiny, from consequence. On the night of March 15th, 1947, 4 people boarded for what should have been a simple overnight sail. By midnight, the Mary E had been blown apart by an explosion so violent it shattered windows a mile inland. 2 people were dead, 2 were alive. And the question that followed, whether this was a tragic accident or a carefully staged double murder, would become one of the most debated mysteries in American maritime history. Because someone bought dynamite the day before, someone rigged a timing device to a yacht battery, and someone rowed away just minutes before the blast. This is the dark story of the Mary E explosion, a yacht blown apart to hide a murder. We're going to cover everything, from the vessel's luxurious construction and the family who owned it, to the tensions that simmered below deck. All the way through the explosion, the investigation, and the trial that captivated a nation. Was this love, or was this murder disguised as misfortune? The Mary E was not unique. In the years following World War II, Southern California's harbors swelled with pleasure craft. Men who had made fortunes in wartime contracts or post-war development bought yachts the way they bought cars, symbols of arrival, of permanence, of a life insulated from the struggles most Americans still faced. Gasoline was no longer rationed. Steel was available again. And if you had the money, you could commission a vessel built to your specifications. Sleeping capacity, engine type, whether you wanted a fighting chair for Marlin or a salon large enough for bridge games. Newport Beach, in particular, became a kind of anchorage for California's moneyed class. The harbor was protected, the climate forgiving. You could keep a yacht there year-round without worrying about winter storms or ice. And the social life, yacht club dinners, regattas, weekend sails to Catalina, offered a curated world where everyone knew everyone, and newcomers were scrutinized before being welcomed. Walter Overell was not a newcomer. He had been in Newport for years, respected, if not especially warm. A man in his 50s who wore tailored slacks even on deck, who kept his investments quiet and his social circle small. His wife, Beulah, matched him in temperament, gracious in public, reserved in private. They were the kind of couple you saw at charity luncheons, but never really knew. Their daughter, Beulah Louise Overell, everyone called her Louise, was different. 17 years old in the spring of 1947. Dark-haired, slender, with the kind of poise that came from private schools and summers abroad. She wore pearls to the marina. She owned more luggage than most families owned furniture. And she was engaged to a young man her parents did not approve of. His name was George Gollum, though everyone called him Bud. He was 21, a college dropout, handsome in a clean-cut, forgettable way. He had no family money, no career prospects, no particular skill beyond a vague interest in engineering. What he had was Louise's attention, and that, according to those who knew the Overells, was the problem. Walter and Beulah did not forbid the relationship outright. That would have been unseemly. Instead, they applied pressure quietly. Suggestions that Louise was too young to marry. Observations that Bud lacked ambition. Hints that perhaps a year abroad, studying in Europe, would give her perspective. Louise ignored them. And on March 15th, when her parents invited her and Bud to spend the night aboard the Mary E, she accepted. Whether it was an olive branch or a final attempt at persuasion, no one could say. But all 4 of them, Walter, Beulah, Louise, and Bud, boarded the yacht that evening, and by morning only 2 would still be breathing. The Mary E was moored in a slip near the center of the harbor. Not isolated, but not crowded either. Close enough to other yachts that voices carried across the water, but far enough that you could have a private conversation if you kept your tone low. It was a warm evening. The kind of night where you could sit on deck in shirt sleeves and feel the temperature drop only slightly as the sun disappeared. The yacht rocked gently, held in place by lines that creaked but never strained. The water was dark, oil slick smooth, reflecting the lights from the shore in soft smears of yellow and white. Inside, the Mary E. was immaculate. The salon, essentially a small living room, featured built-in seating upholstered in deep green fabric, a fold-down table for dining, brass lamps with frosted glass shades. Everything was compact, but finished to a standard you'd expect in a much larger vessel. The wood was oiled, not varnished, giving it a soft glow under lamplight. The portholes were polished. Even the galley, barely larger than a closet, was organized with a precision that suggested someone cared deeply about maintaining appearances. Walter and Beulah slept in the master stateroom, a narrow cabin at the stern with a double berth and just enough headroom to stand upright if you were careful. Louise and Bud were given separate quarters. Propriety still mattered, even aboard a family yacht. Bud's bunk was little more than a cot tucked into a forward compartment. Louise's was slightly larger, with a small porthole and a shelf for her belongings. The yacht had a galley stove, but dinner that night was simple. Cold cuts, bread, fruit, a bottle of wine that Walter opened but did not finish. The conversation, by all later accounts, was civil. Strained, perhaps, but not hostile. They discussed plans for the next day, a short sail, possibly to Catalina, depending on the weather. Walter mentioned needing to check the engine. Beulah asked if anyone wanted coffee. Louise said little. Bud, sensing the tension, attempted humor that landed flat. By 10:30, everyone had retreated to their quarters. The yacht settled into silence. The kind of silence that exists only on the water, where the absence of traffic and machinery lets you hear the smallest sounds. The slap of a halyard against a mast, the murmur of voices from a neighboring boat, the hum of the bilge pump cycling on and off. And then, sometime around 11, Louise and Bud left the yacht. The story they told later was straightforward. Walter had asked them to go ashore and pick up hamburgers, a late-night snack. The dinghy was tied alongside, and rowing to the dock took only a few minutes. They walked to a nearby diner, ordered food, and were waiting for it to be wrapped when they heard the explosion. That was their version, and for a brief window of time, perhaps an hour, perhaps less, it was accepted without question. But the details, when examined closely, began to fracture. Why send 2 people for hamburgers when one could have gone? Why leave the yacht at all when the galley was fully stocked? And why, if the errand was so mundane, did no one at the diner remember seeing them? The explosion occurred at approximately 11:50 p.m. Witnesses across Newport Beach described it the same way. A flash of light, a sound like thunder, and then a pressure wave that rattled windows and set off car alarms. Those closer to the harbor felt it in their chests, a physical thump that knocked pictures off walls and sent glassware sliding across tables. The Mary E. did not burn slowly. It detonated. The fireball was visible for miles, a sphere of orange and white that rose into the night sky before collapsing into smoke. Debris rained into the water, chunks of decking, shredded canvas, pieces of brass hardware glowing red from the heat. The surrounding yachts rocked violently, their mooring straining as the shockwave passed through the harbor. Harbor patrol responded within minutes. Searchlights swept the water, catching fragments of wreckage drifting in the current. The smell was immediate and overwhelming. Burning wood, scorched rubber, and something else. Something chemical and wrong. They found Louise and Bud in the dinghy, approximately 200 yards from where the Mary E. had been moored. Both were wet. Both were shaking. Louise was crying, her voice high and frantic, repeating that they had been ashore when it happened, that they didn't know what went wrong, that her parents were still on the boat. Bud said less. He sat in the dinghy with his hands gripping the gunwales, staring at the burning wreckage as if trying to understand what he was seeing. The bodies of Walter and Beulah Overell were recovered in the early hours of March 16th. They were found together in what had been the salon, their remains so badly burned that identification required dental records. The blast had torn through the yacht structure, collapsing the deck and splitting the hull. What remained was a charred skeleton of ribs and stringers, half submerged and still smoldering. The initial assumption was mechanical failure, gas leak perhaps, or a spark in the engine compartment igniting fumes. Yachts, especially older ones, carried inherent risks. Fuel lines degraded, batteries sparked, engines overheated, and the Overells, despite their wealth, were not experienced sailors. It was conceivable, plausible even, that Walter had made a mistake. Left a valve open. Failed to ventilate the bilge. Any number of small errors could have cascaded into catastrophe. But by dawn, that theory was already unraveling. Investigators combing through the wreckage found sticks of dynamite. Not residue, not trace elements. Actual unexploded sticks, waterlogged but intact, wedged into the debris. 31 of them still bundled together with wire. They also found the remains of a timing device. A simple mechanism, an alarm clock connected to a battery. The kind of setup a high school student could assemble with basic tools and a rudimentary understanding of circuits. And they found blood. Not much, and not in a pattern that suggested a struggle, but enough to indicate that something had happened before the explosion. Something violent. The autopsies were rushed, performed within hours of the bodies being recovered, under conditions that were far from ideal. The coroner noted skull fractures on both victims. Trauma consistent with blunt force. Not definitive, burns and blast damage can mimic other injuries, but suggestive. Suggestive enough that, by midday on March 16th, Louise Overell and Bud Gollum were no longer treated as survivors. They were suspects. The interrogation began gently. Louise and Bud were separated, taken to different rooms, offered coffee and blankets. The detectives were polite, sympathetic even. They expressed condolences. They asked if the couple needed anything, a lawyer perhaps, or time to rest. Louise declined. She wanted to talk, she wanted to explain. She repeated the story about the hamburgers. Her father had asked them to go ashore. It was close to 11. They took the dinghy, rowed to the dock, walked to the diner. She didn't remember the name of the place. She didn't remember what they ordered. She remembered the explosion. How could she forget? And rowing back as fast as they could, but by then the yacht was already gone. Bud's version matched hers, with minor variations. He remembered the diner's name. He thought they had left the yacht closer to 11:15. He wasn't sure if Walter had specifically asked them to go, or if it had been a suggestion. But yes, they were ashore when it happened. Yes, they came back immediately. Yes, they had no idea what caused the explosion. The detectives let them talk. They took notes. They asked clarifying questions. And then, carefully, they introduced a new detail. The dynamite. Where had it come from? Louise hesitated, then admitted that Bud had purchased it the day before. 23 sticks, bought from a supplier in Los Angeles. Why? Her father had asked him to. Walter was planning some kind of construction project. She wasn't sure of the details. Bud had simply done what was requested. It was completely innocent. Bud confirmed this when asked. Yes, he bought the dynamite. Yes, it was at Walter's request. He still had the receipt. He could show them if they wanted. The detectives did want. And when they examined the receipt, they noted the date, March 14th, one day before the explosion, and the quantity, 23 sticks. They had found 31 sticks in the wreckage, which meant either the receipt was wrong, or someone had acquired more dynamite elsewhere, or Bud was lying. The story began to bend under its own weight. The yacht did not sink immediately. For several hours after the explosion, the Mary E's hull remained partially afloat, held up by buoyancy chambers that had somehow survived the blast. It drifted slowly towards the harbor mouth, trailing debris, a ghost ship illuminated by searchlights as investigators circled in patrol boats, photographing what remained. By sunrise, it had settled into the mud. The stern was submerged. The bow pointed skyward at an angle that looked almost deliberate, as if the yacht were trying to climb out of the water. Gulls landed on the exposed sections, pecking at nothing, then flying away. The recovery operation took 3 days. Divers went down in shifts, working in water so murky that visibility was measured in inches. They groped through the wreckage by touch, pulling out fragments of furniture, pieces of the engine, sections of the salon's teak paneling. Everything smelled of gasoline and burnt insulation. Everything was catalogued, tagged, and laid out on the dock in rows. It was during this process that the full scope of the evidence emerged. Not all at once, but in pieces. A wire here, a battery terminal there, a clock mechanism with its face shattered, but its gears still intact. The dynamite sticks were clustered in what had been the engine compartment, not scattered by the blast, but grouped together, suggesting they had been placed deliberately rather than stored carelessly. The wiring was crude, but functional. A textbook example of a time-delayed ignition system. The alarm clock was a Westclox, a common model sold in hardware stores across the country. Its hands were frozen at 11:47, 3 minutes before the explosion. Investigators also found a metal stanchion missing from the yacht's deck railing. The gap was obvious once you knew to look for it, a section where the support post had been removed or torn away. The stanchion itself was never recovered, but its absence was noted, photographed, and entered into evidence. Because a metal stanchion, roughly 2 feet long and weighted at one end, would make an effective weapon. Heavy enough to fracture a skull, easy to grip, easy to swing. And if you were trying to stage an accident, trying to make a double murder look like a gas explosion, you might want to dispose of the weapon by throwing it overboard before the blast. The autopsies were problematic from the start. The coroner, a man named Dr. Leland, had been roused from sleep and asked to examine 2 bodies so badly burned that portions of the skeleton were exposed. He worked quickly, perhaps too quickly, under pressure from investigators who wanted answers before the press descended in full force. His preliminary findings noted skull fractures on both Walter and Beulah Overell. The fractures were located on the back of the head in Walter's case and along the temple in Beulah's. Dr. Leland could not say definitively whether these injuries occurred before or after the explosion. Blast trauma can cause bone to crack. Heat can cause bone to warp and split. But the pattern, the location and severity, was consistent with blunt force. He also noted the absence of soot in the victim's lungs. In a fire, people who are alive inhale smoke. The lungs show it. Walter and Beulah's lungs showed nothing, which meant either they had died before the fire started, or they had been unconscious and not breathing at the moment of ignition. Neither possibility supported the theory of an accident. Dr. Leland's report was released to investigators on March 17th. By March 18th, it had leaked to the press, and by March 19th, the story had metastasized into a national sensation. The headlines wrote themselves. Heiress and boyfriend questioned in yacht blast deaths. Parents opposed romance, then died in explosion. Lovers or killers. The mystery of the Mary E. Reporters descended on Newport Beach like a migrating flock. They camped outside the police station, the courthouse, the harbor where the wreckage still sat half submerged. They interviewed neighbors, yacht club members, anyone who had known the Overells or seen the couple in the days before the explosion. They dug into Walter's finances, Beulah's charity work, Louise's school records, Bud's employment history. What they found was a family that appeared, on the surface, entirely ordinary. Wealthy, yes, but not ostentatious, not scandalous. The Overells gave to churches. They attended civic events. Walter had investments in real estate and agriculture, all legitimate, all properly documented. Beulah volunteered with local hospital committees. Louise had good grades, good manners, and no record of trouble. Bud was harder to pin down. He had attended a small engineering college for 2 semesters before dropping out. He had worked intermittently, odd jobs mostly, nothing that lasted. He had no criminal record, no debts, no obvious vices. He was, by most accounts, pleasant, unmemorable. The kind of young man you might meet at a party and forget within an hour. But he was also the young man who, one day before the explosion, had purchased 23 sticks of dynamite. The purchase was traced to a supplier in suburban Los Angeles. The store owner remembered Bud clearly, a polite young man who said he needed the dynamite for a construction project. Clearing stumps, he'd said, or maybe it was boulders. The owner couldn't recall the exact words, but he remembered thinking it was odd that someone so young would be handling explosives. Still, the request wasn't illegal. You could buy dynamite in 1947 if you had a reason and cash. Bud had both. The receipt showed he paid $12. He also purchased blasting caps, wire, and a battery. Everything you'd need to build a bomb. When confronted with this, Bud insisted it had been Walter's idea. His future father-in-law had asked him to pick up the supplies. Bud had simply done as he was told. He still had the receipt to prove it. But Walter was dead, and the only other person who could confirm the story was Louise, whose testimony was hardly impartial. The theory that began to take shape, first in whispers among investigators, then in newsprint, was this. Louise and Bud had planned the murders together. Motive was inheritance. Walter Overell's estate was valued at approximately $500,000, a staggering sum in 1947. Louise stood to inherit everything. And with her parents dead, there would be no one to oppose her marriage to Bud. The method was brutal, but effective. Wait until nightfall. Lure the parents into a false sense of security. Then strike. A stanchion or hammer to the skull, quick and quiet. Afterward, plant the dynamite, set the timer, and leave the yacht under the pretense of fetching hamburgers. Row to shore, establish an alibi, and wait for the explosion to erase the evidence. It was a plan that required nerve, and luck, and a willingness to kill 2 people in cold blood. The prosecution would argue that Louise and Bud had both. The arrest came on March 21st, 6 days after the explosion. Louise was taken into custody at her family's home, a sprawling estate in the hills above Newport Beach. She was wearing a tailored skirt and blouse, pearls at her throat, her hair pinned back in the style favored by young women who attended finishing schools. She did not resist. She asked if she could bring a suitcase. Bud was arrested at his apartment, a modest 1-bedroom in a less expensive part of town. He had been expecting it. He answered the door before the detectives knocked. Both were charged with 2 counts of murder. Bail was denied, and both were held in the Orange County Jail, separated by walls but close enough that, had they been allowed, they could have spoken to each other through the ventilation system. They were not allowed, but they found another way. The letters began almost immediately. Smuggled out by a sympathetic guard, passed between cells, written on scraps of paper in pencil and ink. They were love letters, mostly. Declarations of devotion, promises that they would survive this, that the truth would come out, that they would be together again. But they were also incriminating. In one letter, Bud wrote, "I would do anything for you. Anything. You know that." In another, Louise responded, "They can't prove what they don't know. We just have to stay strong." Oh, were these the words of murderers reassuring each other? Or frightened young people clinging to hope? The interpretation depended entirely on what you already believed. The letters were intercepted in early April. By mid-April, they had been leaked to the press. And by late April, excerpts were being published in newspapers across the country, analyzed by amateur sleuths and armchair detectives who were convinced they had solved the case. The public reaction was split. Some saw two cold-blooded killers who deserved the gas chamber. Others saw a pair of star-crossed lovers, victims of circumstance and overzealous prosecution. The division was sharp, almost tribal. People argued about it in diners, in barbershops, in living rooms. The Overell case became a litmus test, not just for guilt or innocence, but for how you viewed wealth, youth, and the idea that beautiful people might also be capable of terrible things. The trial was scheduled for October. 5 months away. Long enough for the story to settle into the public consciousness. Long enough for theories to harden into convictions. The yacht, meanwhile, was towed to a salvage yard and dismantled piece by piece. The hull was cut apart with torches, the metal sold for scrap, the wood burned. By summer, nothing remained of the Mary E. except photographs and a few charred fragments preserved as evidence. But the memory lingered. In Newport Beach, people still spoke about the night the harbor shook. They pointed out the slip where the yacht had been moored. They told visitors about the explosion, embellishing details. Some claimed they had felt the blast from miles away. Others said they had seen the fireball reflected off the clouds. The truth, as always, was more mundane. Most people had been asleep. Most had only heard about it the next morning, secondhand, over coffee and newspapers. But memory is flexible. And in the absence of certainty, people filled the gaps with what felt true. The crime scene itself was never properly preserved. In 1947, forensic protocols were rudimentary at best. Chain of custody was a suggestion, not a requirement. Evidence was handled by multiple people, transported in unmarked containers, stored in offices that were not secure. The dynamite sticks, for example, were kept in a cardboard box in a detective's desk drawer. The clock mechanism was photographed, but not protected from handling. The blood samples, what little had been collected, were refrigerated inconsistently. Defense attorneys would later argue that the entire investigation was contaminated. That evidence had been mishandled, possibly planted, certainly compromised. That the prosecution's case rested on assumptions rather than facts. But in the spring of 1947, with public outrage mounting and pressure on law enforcement to deliver justice, those concerns were secondary. The priority was conviction. Investigators continued to build their case through the summer. They interviewed everyone who had known the Overells, searching for evidence of tension between Louise and her parents. They found it, though not in the dramatic form they might have hoped. Walter and Beulah had expressed concerns about Bud. Quiet concerns, shared with friends over dinner or in private conversations. They thought he was after Louise's money. They thought she was too young to marry. They had suggested postponing the engagement, perhaps encouraging Louise to travel or continue her education. But they had not forbidden the relationship. They had not disowned their daughter or issued ultimatums. They had, by all accounts, tried to manage the situation delicately, which made the idea that Louise would murder them, that she would choose Bud over her parents with such finality, seem almost incomprehensible. Unless, of course, she and Bud had believed that gentle pressure would eventually escalate, that Walter and Beulah were simply biding their time, waiting for the right moment to separate the couple permanently, that the yacht trip itself was a prelude to something worse. Fear of loss can drive people to terrible decisions. And if Louise and Bud believed they were about to lose everything, each other, the inheritance, the future they had imagined, then perhaps the murders made a kind of desperate sense. Or perhaps not. Perhaps they were innocent, and the explosion had been exactly what it appeared to be at first. A tragic accident involving a wealthy man who dabbled in things he didn't understand, who stored explosives carelessly, who made a mistake that cost him and his wife their lives. The problem was evidence. And the problem with the evidence was that it pointed in multiple directions simultaneously. The dynamite proved premeditation, unless Walter had bought it and Bud was simply following orders. The skull fractures proved violence, unless they were caused by the explosion itself. The timing device proved intent, unless it had been set by Walter, perhaps as a delayed charge for some construction project he planned to begin the next day. Every fact could be interpreted two ways. Every piece of evidence carried doubt embedded in its center like a flaw in glass. And as the trial approached, it became clear that the case would not hinge on what had happened, but on which version of what had happened the jury found more believable. The courtroom in Santa Ana was not large enough for the crowds that wanted in. By the time the trial began in October, the Overell case had become a spectacle. Reporters from Los Angeles, San Francisco, even New York had descended on Orange County. Photographers lined the courthouse steps. Sketch artists sat in the gallery, capturing Louise's profile, Bud's posture, the judge's expression as he gavelled for order. Louise arrived each morning dressed carefully. Not in morning black. That choice, or lack of choice, was noted by every society columnist covering the trial. Instead, she wore pastels, soft blues and grays, modest necklines, pearl earrings. Her hair was styled simply, pulled back from her face. She looked young, fragile, exactly like what she was. A 17-year-old girl whose parents had died violently and who was now on trial for their murder. Bud wore suits that didn't quite fit. His collars were too tight. His ties sat crooked. He looked uncomfortable, which he was. But he also looked earnest. He met the jury's eyes when they were led in. He stood when the judge entered. He did everything a young man accused of murder should do if he wanted to appear respectful and innocent. The prosecution's opening statement was delivered by a district attorney named Eugene Williams. He was in his 40s, experienced, with a reputation for securing convictions in difficult cases. He stood before the jury and spoke slowly, letting each word settle. "This is a case about greed," he said, "and lust, and the terrible things that happen when young people decide that their desires matter more than human life." He outlined the state's theory. Louise Overell and George Gollum had conspired to murder Walter and Beulah Overell in order to inherit a fortune and remove the only obstacle to their marriage. They had purchased dynamite under false pretenses. They had lured the victims onto the yacht, killed them with blunt force trauma, then staged an explosion to destroy the evidence. They had rowed ashore, established a flimsy alibi, and waited for the blast that would make them both wealthy and free. "The evidence will show," Williams continued, "that these two defendants are the only people who could have committed this crime. They had motive, they had means, they had opportunity, and they had no hesitation when it came to ending two lives in order to get what they wanted." The defense attorney was a man named Otto Jacobs, a criminal lawyer from Los Angeles with a different kind of reputation. He was theatrical, aggressive, known for turning trials into performances. He did not disappoint. "The prosecution wants you to believe," Jacobs said, pacing in front of the jury box, "that a 17-year-old girl and her 21-year-old boyfriend are criminal masterminds. That they planned and executed a perfect murder. That they fooled investigators, covered their tracks, and almost got away with it." He paused, letting the absurdity hang in the air. "But look at the evidence. Really look at it. You'll find contradictions. You'll find assumptions. You'll find a rush to judgment by law enforcement desperate to solve a case that terrified the community. What you won't find is proof. Not real proof. Not the kind of proof required to send two young people to the gas chamber." The battle lines were drawn, and for the next 4 months, the courtroom became a stage where two competing narratives fought for dominance. The prosecution called its witnesses in careful sequence. First, the harbor patrol officers who had responded to the explosion. They described the scene, the fireball, the debris, the smell. They testified that when they found Louise and Bud in the dinghy, both appeared wet but otherwise unharmed. Louise had been crying. Bud had been silent, staring at the wreckage. Next came the investigators who had examined the Mary E.'s remains. They brought photographs, large, glossy prints mounted on boards and displayed for the jury. Images of charred wood, twisted metal, the dynamite sticks bundled together, the clock mechanism with its wires still attached. One detective, a man named Raymond, testified about the missing stanchion. He explained that the yacht's railing had 8 support posts, but only 7 were accounted for after the explosion. The 8th had been removed, cleanly, he noted, not torn away by the blast. He produced a length of similar metal piping to show the jury. This, he said, holding it up, could fracture a human skull with a single blow. The defense objected. Speculation. The judge sustained it. But the image remained in the jury's mind. Bud Gollum, gripping that stanchion, swinging it down onto Walter Overell's head, while the older man sat unsuspecting in the salon. Dr. Leland, the coroner, testified about the autopsies. He was nervous on the stand. This was, after all, a murder trial, and his findings were central to the prosecution's case. He described the skull fractures. He admitted, under cross-examination, that he could not say with absolute certainty whether the injuries had occurred before or after the explosion. "But in your professional opinion," Williams asked, "is it more likely that these fractures resulted from blunt force trauma or from blast effects?" "Some blunt force," Leland said quietly. "And the absence of soot in the lungs. What does that tell you?" "That the victims were not breathing at the time of the fire, meaning they were already dead." "Objection," Jacob said, standing. "Calls for speculation." "I'll rephrase," Williams said smoothly. "Doctor, in your experience, when a person is alive during a fire, do their lungs show evidence of smoke inhalation?" "Yes." "And in this case, was there any such evidence?" "No." It was damning. Not conclusive, but damning. The prosecution's case built slowly, methodically. They called the store owner who had sold Bud the dynamite. He testified that Bud had seemed calm, knowledgeable, not at all nervous. He had asked specific questions about blasting caps and detonation. "He knew what he was doing," the store owner said. They called neighbors of the Overells, who testified that Walter and Beulah had expressed concerns about Bud. Not hatred, not rage, just worry. The kind of parental worry that feels suffocating to a teenager in love. They called a forensic expert who explained how the timing device worked, how simple it was to construct, how a person with basic knowledge, say someone who had attended engineering classes, could assemble one in under an hour. And then, in a moment of courtroom drama that would be discussed for years, the prosecution introduced the letters. There were 17 in total, written in pencil on scraps of paper, smuggled between cells, intercepted by guards. Williams read excerpts aloud, his voice flat, letting the words speak for themselves. "Louise," Bud had written, "I can't stop thinking about you. About us. About what we have to do to survive this. We have to be strong. We have to trust each other. No matter what they say, no matter what they try to prove, we know the truth, and the truth is that we belong together. Forever." Louise's response, "I'm scared, Bud. I'm so scared. But I know you're right. We just have to get through this. They can't prove anything if we don't let them. We have to remember what we talked about. We have to stick to the story." The courtroom was silent as Williams read. When he finished, he placed the letters on the prosecutor's table and looked at the jury. "Stick to the story," he repeated. "Not stick to the truth. The story." It was effective, devastatingly so. But the defense was ready. When Jacobs cross-examined the guard who had intercepted the letters, He focused on context. "These are two frightened young people," he said, "facing murder charges for a crime they didn't commit. Of course they're trying to reassure each other. Of course they're scared. That doesn't make them guilty." He also pointed out that nowhere in the letters did either Louise or Bud admit to the murders. Nowhere did they discuss the mechanics of the crime, or express regret, or reveal details that only the killers would know. "These letters," Jacobs argued, "are evidence of love, not murder." The jury's reaction was impossible to read. Some nodded, others frowned. Most simply watched, absorbing information, waiting for more. The prosecution's case concluded with a demonstration. Williams brought the clock mechanism into the courtroom, along with a battery and lengths of wire. He asked the forensic expert to explain, step by step, how the bomb would have worked. The expert complied, speaking in measured tones about circuits and timers and detonation sequences. And then Williams produced a small cloth bag. He upended it onto the table. Dozens of tiny screws spilled out, clattering across the wood. "The prosecution has argued," he said, "that this particular screw," he held up a screw recovered from the yacht, "is rare, unique. Proof that the bomb was constructed deliberately." He gestured to the pile on the table. "These screws were purchased from 5 different hardware stores in Orange County. All of them identical to the screw found on the Mary E. All of them commonly available. The rarity argument is false, but the fact that this screw was found on the yacht, connected to a timing device wired to dynamite, is not." It was a strong close. And when the prosecution rested its case, the general feeling in the courtroom was that conviction seemed likely. But the defense had not yet begun. Jacobs opened by attacking the investigation itself. He called witnesses, other detectives, not involved in the case, who testified that proper forensic protocols had not been followed. Evidence had been mishandled. The crime scene had been compromised. The autopsies had been rushed. This entire case, Jacobs argued, is built on a foundation of guesswork and incompetence. He called expert witnesses who contradicted Dr. Leland's findings. One pathologist testified that skull fractures of the type found on Walter and Beulah could absolutely have been caused by the explosion. Another testified that the absence of soot in the lungs was inconclusive. Bodies burned at high temperatures often showed no traces of inhalation. Jacobs also introduced an alternate theory. What if Walter Overell himself had brought the dynamite aboard? What if he was planning to use it for some purpose? Construction, demolition, even sabotage of a business rival, and had stored it improperly? What if the explosion was, in fact, an accident? There was no evidence for this theory, but there was also no evidence against it. And in a criminal trial, where the burden of proof rests with the prosecution, reasonable doubt is a powerful weapon. The defense's most dramatic moment came when Jacobs called Bud Gollum to the stand. Bud walked slowly to the witness box. He was sworn in. He sat. And for 3 hours, he answered questions in a voice that barely rose above a whisper. Yes, he had purchased the dynamite. Yes, Walter Overell had asked him to. No, he didn't know what it was for. No, he didn't think it was strange. He was trying to make a good impression on his future father-in-law. He wanted to help. "Did you kill Walter Overell?" Jacobs asked. "No." "Did you kill Beulah Overell?" "No." "Did you set the bomb that destroyed the Mary E?" "No." Williams cross-examined aggressively. He hammered Bud on inconsistencies. Why couldn't he remember the name of the diner? Why did his timeline keep changing? Why did he wait so long to mention that Walter had asked for the dynamite? Bud stumbled. He contradicted himself. He looked guilty, not of murder, necessarily, but of something. Of lying. Of withholding information. Of being involved in ways he refused to admit. but he did not confess. And he did not break. Louise testified next. She wore pale blue, no jewelry except a simple cross on a chain. She cried quietly as she described the night of the explosion, the sudden light, the sound, the terrible realization that her parents were gone. "Did you love your parents?" Jacobs asked. "Yes," Louise whispered. "Did you kill them?" "No, never. I could never." Williams was gentler with Louise than he had been with Bud. Perhaps he sensed that attacking a 17-year-old girl too harshly would alienate the jury. But he still pressed. "You stood to inherit a great deal of money, didn't you?" "I don't care about money." "But you knew you would inherit?" "I suppose. I never thought about it." "You never thought about $500,000? My parents were alive. Why would I think about inheriting?" It was a good answer, maybe too good. Rehearsed, some thought, but delivered with enough emotion that it landed. The defense rested. Closing arguments began. Williams spoke for 2 hours. He recounted the evidence piece by piece. The dynamite, the timing device, the skull fractures, the missing stanchion, the letters, the motive. He argued that Louise and Bud were guilty beyond any reasonable doubt, that their stories were fabrications, that their grief was performance. "These two defendants," he concluded, "believed they could commit the perfect crime. They believed wealth and youth would protect them. They were wrong. And now it is your duty, as jurors, to hold them accountable." Jacob spoke for 3 hours. He dismantled the prosecution's case point by point. He highlighted the lack of physical evidence tying Louise or Bud directly to the murders. He emphasized the investigative failures, the alternate explanations, the gaps in the timeline. "The prosecution wants you to fill those gaps with assumptions," he said. "But assumptions are not evidence. And in America, we do not convict people based on what might have happened. We convict based on what did happen. And the prosecution has not proven what happened. They have guessed, and guesses are not enough." The jury deliberated for 5 days. The waiting was unbearable. Louise and Bud remained in custody, separated, with no contact except the knowledge that somewhere in the same building, the other was also waiting. The courtroom emptied each evening and refilled each morning with spectators hoping this would be the day. Reporters smoked in the hallways. Sketch artists refined their drawings. The judge waited in his chambers. Inside the jury room, 12 people wrestled with $500,000, 2 dead bodies, and a story that made sense only if you were willing to believe that teenagers were capable of patricide. The evidence was laid out on tables. Photographs of the wreckage, the clock mechanism in a plastic bag, transcripts of testimony stacked in folders. The jurors went through it methodically, then went through it again. They argued, they voted, they changed their minds. One juror believed Louise was innocent, but Bud was guilty. Another thought both were guilty, but the prosecution had failed to prove it. A third thought the whole thing was an accident, and the trial itself was a witch hunt. They deadlocked. They took breaks. They returned and tried again. On the 5th day, they reached consensus. Not unanimity. That would be too much to ask. But enough agreement to deliver a verdict. The courtroom filled within minutes of the announcement. Louise was brought in first, wearing the same pale blue dress she had worn while testifying. Bud followed, his suit rumpled from days of waiting. They sat at the defense table, not touching, barely looking at each other. The tension in the room was physical, like humidity before a storm. The jury filed in. No one could read their faces. The foreman, a middle-aged man who owned a hardware store, held a slip of paper folded in half. The judge asked if they had reached a verdict. "We have, Your Honor." On the charge of murder in the first degree of Walter Overell, how do you find the defendant, Beulah Louise Overell? Not guilty. The courtroom erupted. Gasps, shouts, someone screamed. The judge's gavel came down like gunfire, demanding order, but the noise continued. Louise collapsed forward, her face in her hands, sobbing. Bud sat frozen, his mouth open, disbelieving. On the charge of murder in the first degree of Beulah Overell, how do you find the defendant Beulah Louise Overell? Not guilty. More chaos. The judge threatened to clear the courtroom. Bailiffs moved toward the gallery, hands raised, calling for quiet. It took minutes before order was restored enough for the foreman to continue. On the charge of murder in the first degree of Walter Overell, how do you find the defendant George Gollum? Not guilty. On the charge of murder in the first degree of Beulah Overell, how do you find the defendant George Gollum? Not guilty. The courtroom became a riot of sound. People cheered, people booed. Reporters rushed for the exits, racing to telephones. Louise and Bud embraced, clinging to each other, while their attorneys shook hands and photographers pushed forward, cameras flashing. The judge gavelled one final time. The defendants are free to go. And just like that, it was over. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had grown to hundreds. Some had been waiting since dawn. When Louise emerged, flanked by lawyers and her remaining family members, the crowd surged. People shouted questions. Was she happy? Did she feel vindicated? What would she do now? Louise said nothing. She walked quickly to a waiting car, her face hidden behind sunglasses, and was driven away. Bud left through a side entrance. Fewer people noticed. He signed autographs for a handful of teenage girls who had followed the trial obsessively, convinced of his innocence and perhaps a little in love with the idea of him. Then he too disappeared into a car and was gone. The newspapers the next day were split. Some headlines celebrated. Justice prevails. Young lovers freed. Others condemned. Murderers walk. Jury fails. Overell family. Editorial pages filled with opinions, angry letters, theories about what the verdict meant for the American justice system. But the most interesting reaction came from the jury itself. In interviews conducted weeks later, several jurors admitted they believed Louise and Bud were probably guilty, but probably was not the standard. The prosecution had not proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt. The evidence was circumstantial. The investigation was flawed, and sending two young people to the gas chamber required more certainty than they had been given. "We couldn't know for sure," one juror said. And if you can't know for sure, you can't convict. It was a principled position. It was also deeply unsatisfying to anyone who believed justice required more than legal technicalities. Louise Overell inherited her parents' estate within weeks of the acquittal. The process was expedited. There were no other heirs, no contested claims. The house, the investments, the bank accounts, all of it transferred to a 17-year-old girl who had just been acquitted of murdering the people who had left it to her. The fortune was real. Not quite $500,000, as some reports had claimed, but close. Enough that Louise would never need to work. Enough that she could live comfortably for the rest of her life on the interest alone. She did not return to Newport Beach. She left California entirely, moving first to Arizona, then to the Midwest, settling eventually in a small town where no one knew her face. She changed her name legally, adopting her mother's maiden name, and lived quietly. Very quietly. Bud Gollum did not go with her. The engagement dissolved within months of the trial's end. No formal announcement was made. No breakup was publicized. They simply stopped being seen together. Louise moved away. Bud stayed in California, drifting between jobs: used car salesman, insurance agent, assistant manager at a hardware store. He married eventually, though not to Louise. He had children. He lived an unremarkable life. When asked about the trial in later years, and he was asked occasionally, by reporters dredging up old scandals, he said only that it had been the worst period of his life, and that he preferred not to discuss it. He never publicly admitted guilt. But he also never protested his innocence with the fervor one might expect from someone wrongly accused. He died in 1984 of a heart attack in a suburb of Los Angeles. His obituary did not mention the Mary E. Louise lived longer. She married twice, both times to men who either didn't know her history or chose not to care. She had no children. She donated to charities, attended church, and kept to herself. Neighbors described her as polite but distant, someone who seemed haunted, though they couldn't say by what. She died in 2005, at the age of 75, in a nursing home in Illinois. Her estate, what remained of it after decades of careful living, was left to animal welfare organizations. No mention of her parents, no acknowledgement of the trial. Her death certificate listed her cause of death as pneumonia and her occupation as retired. The Mary E. was gone long before either of them died, scrapped and sold for parts in the months after the trial. But the story endured. It became a staple of true crime anthologies, a case study in law schools, a favorite topic for amateur detectives who believed they could solve what the jury could not. Books were written, documentaries were produced, podcasts dedicated entire seasons to re-examining the evidence. Each new generation discovered the story and arrived at the same inconclusive ending. Probably guilty, but never proven. The case also left practical legacies. The failures of the investigation, the mishandled evidence, the rushed autopsies, the lack of proper forensic protocols became a catalyst for reform. Orange County established a dedicated crime laboratory in 1949, partly motivated by the Overell debacle. Procedures were standardized, training was improved, future cases would be handled with more rigor, more care. Whether that was enough to honor the memory of Walter and Beulah Overell is debatable. They were not perfect people, but they did not deserve to die in an explosion on their own yacht. Their skulls fractured, their bodies burned, their deaths staged to look like an accident. And they certainly did not deserve to have their killers, if that's what Louise and Bud were, walk free. The debate continues. In online forums, amateur investigators still argue about the case. Some point to the letters as proof of guilt. Others cite the acquittal as proof of innocence. Some construct elaborate alternate theories. Maybe it was a rival businessman. Maybe it was a disgruntled employee. Maybe Walter really did mishandle the dynamite. But the simplest explanation remains the most compelling. Two young people, in love and desperate, decided that murder was preferable to separation. They planned carefully. They executed brutally. They nearly succeeded. Nearly. Because even though they were acquitted, they did not escape. Louise spent the rest of her life in hiding, running from a name and a history she could never fully shed. Bud lived in obscurity. His one moment of notoriety, a trial for double murder. Neither found happiness. Neither found peace. The Mary E. took more than 2 lives that night in March 1947. It took 4 futures. Walter and Beulah lost theirs in the explosion. Louise and Bud lost theirs in the aftermath. And perhaps that, in the end, is a kind of justice. Not the justice the prosecution wanted. Not the justice the victim's family deserved. But the slow, grinding justice of consequence. Of choices that echo across decades. Of a crime that, even if unpunished by law, was never forgotten and never forgiven. Newport Beach has changed since 1947. The harbor is more crowded now. The yachts are larger, more expensive, equipped with technology that would have seemed like science fiction to Walter Overell. The marina where the Mary E. was moored has been rebuilt twice. The businesses along the waterfront have turned over. The people who witnessed the explosion are dead or dying. But the story persists. Local historians still give tours that include a stop at the approximate location where the yacht sat that night. They point to the water and describe the fireball. They talk about the trial, the acquittal, the mystery that was never solved. And occasionally, someone will ask, "Do you think they did it?" The answer always is the same. Probably. but we'll never know for sure. That uncertainty is the Mary E.'s final legacy. Not the explosion itself, not the trial, not even the deaths, but the unresolved question, the doubt that lingers like smoke, the yacht that became a bomb, the parents who became victims, the lovers who became suspects, the trial that became a spectacle, the verdict that became a controversy, and the truth, whatever it was, that sank into Newport Harbor along with the wreckage and was never fully recovered. In the end, the Mary E. was more than a yacht. It was a sealed environment where wealth and family tension and youthful passion collided with fatal consequences. It was a vessel that held secrets, some spoken, some whispered, some carried to the grave. It was 47 feet of teak and brass and imported velvet, a luxury cruiser built for weekend sails and champagne sunsets, a symbol of California prosperity in the post-war years. And it was a tomb. The yacht is gone. The people are gone. But the story remains, preserved in court transcripts and newspaper archives and the collective memory of a community that witnessed something it could neither fully understand nor completely forget. On calm nights in Newport Harbor, when the water is still and the boats sit silent in their slips, you can almost imagine the Mary E. back in its mooring. You can almost see the lights burning in the salon. You can almost hear voices. A family dinner, awkward but civil, the last meal Walter and Beulah Overell would ever share. And if you listen closely, through the decades and the doubt and the unanswered questions, you can almost hear the tick of a clock mechanism winding down to 0. 3 minutes to midnight. 2 minutes. 1. And then nothing but light and sound, and the terrible knowledge that some crimes, even when they go unpunished, are never truly hidden. The water remembers. The harbor remembers. And somewhere, in the fragments of wreckage that were never recovered, in the cold dark beneath Newport's surface, the Mary E. remembers too.